Alright guys, welcome to the next episode. Again, sorry the bike looks a little bit more complete probably than it did at the end of last episode. I just tend to forget these intros kind of thing. In this episode, we are going to be looking at the front brake master cylinder and installing those lines, the clutch master cylinder, installing those lines, and then working on some dent repair on the gas tank and getting it ready for paint so that we can install it and then try and start up the bike. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, so the next thing that I'd like to tackle, and probably the last major thing that I want to work on, is this dent here in the side of the tank. There's another small dent on the side, but I think that that should be a little bit easier. This dent is a little bit large. I'd say it's about the size of a $50 and then the depth of two $50. I've never really worked with Bondo that much. I did it on my father's car once and it turned out really, really well, but it wasn't really filling in, I guess, what some people may call a crater. So I've got my Bondo ready. I put together like a little palette to make the Bondo on. You're apparently not really supposed to mix it on cardboard, and you're not mixing, like you would two paint colors together. You're actually folding it over itself to limit the amount of air that you're getting in. So I think my plan is just going to be, kind of filling it in and pressing it in and then doing a couple rough curve passes over it. I know it's not going to look perfect. I just want it to not look like a massive dent. And then afterwards, I'll sand it down a little bit, spray it with some filler primer, sand that down, and then just start getting ready for the paint work. So without further ado, I'm going to attempt to repair a tank dent. Now this does say to sand down to bare metal, but it also says to sand with 80 grit sandpaper, and I have just hit this with a wire wheel. I haven't really used a sandpaper. I assume that that's so that it can, have more surface adhesion. So I'm gonna let this mineral spirits dry. I'll go over it with some 80 grit, and then I'll come back in with some mineral spirits and wipe it up and get ready for cleaning. This is the other dent. As you can see, it's much more of a gradual actual dent. Now, I probably could get in there with a dent pusher tool and kind of, pry up and push on some of these spots, but just based on how old this tank is and, the shape of it, I don't want to risk accidentally puncturing through and then I'm out of gas tank, so I'm just going to go ahead and body filler this in. All right, here we go. I would say that's pretty uniform in color. Oh, it definitely made way too much. Oh God. Oh Lord. This is going to take forever to sand. All right, let that dry and see if I can make a at least somewhat presentable dent out of that. Okay, so while I'm waiting for the Bondo to set, I have the master cylinder and the clutch reservoir painted and ready to go, so I'm going to go ahead and install those guys. Okay, now it's time for clutch master cylinder. All right, and while I'm at it, I might as well install the front brake caliper. There we go. All right, now that I'm pretty much done with the bike, I can turn my attention back towards the gas tank. And as you can see, this Bondo turned out to be just a massive blob. And so instead of spending a ton of time hand sanding this, I'm going to most likely take the angle grinder with a mild abrasive wheel just to get a bulk of it down, and then I'll continue sanding that by hand. All right, I guess let's see how this goes. All right, that's not that bad. Now I can do the rest by hand. All right, so that didn't go that badly. I do have a really nice curve in terms of mimicking the other side. However, there are one or two small, very minor little like pinholes that I'd like to potentially fill in. And also on the one side, I sanded just a little bit too far down, and I've actually come back into where it was, making a crater. So when I work on the dent on this side, and I fill that in, I'll just take a little bit left over that I have and smear it on there, and then I'll come back and sand it. Using that angle grinder with the flap disc really sped this up, and then I just came back with 80 and then 220 grit sanding blocks. So I'm gonna clean this up a little bit and then get started on the other dent. Okay, now we let both of those dry. We do it all over again. All right, so while the Bondo is setting on the tank again, round two, I'm going to put the last couple pieces on the bike. I've got the clutch master cylinder line and the brake master cylinder line that need to go on. So I'm going to clean these up a little bit and then route and install them. I don't know why they don't have the rotor on the right side. They would have saved a lot of routing of cables, but it is what it is. This goes back somewhere around here and then down over to the caliper. Okay, now it's clutch time. Maybe I route that end first. appear I may have needed to do this before installing the carbs. All right, so routing that clutch line wasn't terrible. It was a little confusing just because of the different mounting points that there are. I will show a quick clip here of where it actually does route through it. Up here, there's a mounting clip near the front of the bike, then it runs out over the carbs in front of the airbox and down the side of the engine. I did clean out the bleeder screw as well, just because, as we remember from the Concours, that was a little gummed up. Luckily, this wasn't that bad, so now we've got both hydraulic lines on the bike. Okay, and then one of the last things that I'd like to do is I'd actually like to take each of the spark plugs out and drip a little bit of oil on top, and then take the side cover off and just turn it by hand, just because this engine has been sitting for so long that I think whatever assembly lube I put on top has either drained down or it's just not there anymore. So I'd like to go ahead and add some oil, crank it by hand, kind of give it some pre-lube just to make sure everything's okay, and also just to make sure that the engine is free before we try and kick over the starter. Okay. Now I'm going to leave the spark plugs out because when I first turn this over, I'm going to not connect any of the spark plugs or anything like that, probably, or the gas tank either. That way I can eject any of the oil that's still in there. Otherwise it'll be smoking an awful lot. So. All right, let's do some forming again. All right, so I think I've got the Bondo figured out on the gas tank. It took a fair amount of time sanding, rebondoing, sanding some more, but I think I've got it pretty good. Is it perfect? No, but neither is the rest of the bike. It's mine and I'm proud of what I've done with it for the first time I've really ever done any Bondo. So the next step that I'm going to do is just give this one quick wipe down with some mineral spirits to get everything off of it. Then I'm going to do a layer of rust inhibitor just to prevent any of this rust from coming back. Then I'm going to do a filler primer as the kind of the base coat before the top coat. And the reason I'm doing that is to kind of take up some of that space of either the random bumps that I couldn't sand down or some scratches that are all over the place. So I'll lay that down pretty thick, wet sand that to get it to a nice finish, and then I'll start doing the rest of the paint. I do have some nice 2K clear coat for this. That's supposed to, basically mimic like an automotive clear coat with that hardener inside of it. So looking forward to that. I have done plenty of painting for this bike already and other projects as well, so I'm fairly confident in my abilities, but I'm just going to take plenty of time, do it right, hopefully get it right the first time, not run into any mistakes. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with this. It is drizzling a little bit outside, so I'm not terribly concerned when it comes to the rust inhibitor coat, but the rest of the coats I'm going to need to pay much more attention to the weather and just be very cognizant of drying times and recoat times and stuff like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started with this. While I'm working on that in the background, I will probably also be filling up the hydraulic master cylinders for the brakes and the clutch. I've done that a couple times on this channel. It's really not that interesting. You fill up the reservoirs, open the bleeder valve, squeeze it a couple times, get the air out, and you're good to go. So I'm gonna start working on that stuff. Well, that didn't go as planned. Tried bleeding the hydraulic clutch and it wound up turning into a nightmare. All right, so I won't go into too much detail on this because I'm not sure I've entirely solved it yet, but the hydraulic clutch lever wasn't getting stiff. It didn't feel like it was actually doing anything. So I tried looking at a couple things. I just bled and bled and bled. I dripped brake fluid all over the place, but nothing was happening. So What I wound up doing was I took off the hydraulic clutch slave cylinder, and when I just pulled the casing off to reveal this, it looked like congealed fluid or something. It almost looked like Rice Krispie treats in milk is the best way to describe it. So I'm going to attempt to clean all this up, clean up the surfaces a little bit. It took a lot of air pressure to pop this out. I didn't think it would be necessarily that tight. So I'm going to clean this up, rinse it out, reassemble it, put it back on the bike, and then see if I can get it to bleed a little bit better that way. All right, so bleeding this clutch has been a very difficult endeavor. At first, I didn't know, long story short, the clutch was not operating. This brake pedal or this clutch pedal was just no resistance whatsoever. So I was reading online, a lot of people were like, okay, well, you need to turn the bike on its side to get the master cylinder above the brake bolt, and you need to do all the normal steps that we all know how to bleed a clutch system, or rather a hydraulic system. And I said, fine, all this stuff makes sense, and I'm trying it. And I'm like, halfway through a bottle of brake fluid. I'm like, all right, listen, I'm no genius here when it comes to hydraulic systems, but when you have a piston that needs to move and you have a bleed screw that's shut and you squeeze this thing and nothing is moving, I don't feel any resistance whatsoever. That to me says that there's air in the system. And I said, all right, well, what kinds of things can I do? And so I'm tapping on the lines, trying to figure this out. And long story short, nothing was working. I wasn't getting any more significant air bubbles out. And a couple people had recommended using like a power bleeder system where you actually are pulling the fluid out instead of trying to push it with the master cylinder. So I have this Mighty Vac set up from Harbor Freight. I've had it for a number of years now. And I've got vacuum on it set to about 20, PSI or inches of mercury, and hooked up to the bleeder valve. And I wanted to show you guys how much air I was getting out of the system because I thought this was a little abnormal. So I'm going to go ahead and if I open this bleeder screw, see all of this air coming out of the system was giving me trouble. If I shut that now, I'm not going to do it because it causes the hydraulic fluid to squirt all over the place. But now if I engage the clutch lever, there's finally resistance and I can hear stuff moving in here. So I now successfully have this all bled and I can turn my attention to the brakes. The brakes were giving me a whole nother slew of issues. I think I have to take the master cylinder off and probably rebuild that to some extent because it just seems like it's completely clogged. So I need to take a closer look at that. But just wanted to show you guys how to power bleed, especially on an older Honda with these hydraulic clutches. If you're having any issues with bleeding, this is what you might need to do. All right, so remember when I said I've bled clutches and brake lines before and this was going to be non-eventful? That turned out to be entirely false. I've already talked about the clutch and all the work that had to go into that to get it working, but the brake master cylinder was far worse. I will show pictures and videos here, but the master cylinder itself was extremely gunked up. It was gummed up. There were ports that were just fluid couldn't go through. There's like this weird positive pressure relief port where when the cylinder goes through, the fluid is supposed to travel up through that hole so that you're not constantly trying to force more and more fluid down into the brake caliper. So it took like 100 PSI and a lot of brake cleaner in order to clean out that hole. But talk about a pain in the butt when it came to trying to bleed it and trying to figure out, was my master cylinder broken? Was something else wrong? So it just took a lot of testing there, and then again had to use the Mighty Vac in order to bleed this, or at least start bleeding it successfully. And now at least I finally have front brakes. So very excited to have the front brakes and the clutch up and running. I'm going to get back to tackling the tank because that is quite literally the last big part that needs to go back on before we can start this bike. All right, so while I'm waiting for the tank to finish setting for like the 50th time, I can go ahead and I can pop off this side cover. I want to turn the engine over by hands a couple times. Before I do that, I am going to finally add some oil to the bike. It takes about 3 quarts after a essentially full rebuild, so I'm going to add about 2.5, 3, see where the level's at. I know I'm probably going to have to add more after the fact, but I'm going to get this cover off and then go ahead and start prepping to turn over by hand. All right, so I've got engine oil in. This is the only bike I've ever worked on that does not have a oil fill level sight glass on the side. You actually have to use a dipstick on the oil cap. So now I've got the spark plugs out, I've got that cover off. I'm going to go ahead and turn this by hand. Oh good, so it's not seized after sitting for 2 years. So that's really good news. So I think I'm going to turn this for a couple minutes just to get oil moving around a little bit. And then I will hook up the battery and see if the starter turns the motor over. The starter should also hopefully spin this fast enough that it evacuates all that oil that I put on top of the pistons. So that's really good news. I also means the valves are opening and closing, so I didn't mess up the timing. So that's great news also. I feel like I'm trying to hand crank start an old car, you know, like there should be old organ music playing with an old-timey filter and those film distortions. Maybe I'll edit that in. That'd be kind of cute. Some ragtime music, that's what I'm thinking. All right, so I've got the battery temporarily hooked up just with some alligator clamps to make a good contact, and so I'm not using thin wires because they would not like however many cold cranking amps it takes to run this. So the last time I tried to turn this on with this all hooked up for the very first time, the starter just started turning, and that was because, like I said, I had that button was not working properly. So I'm going to put this on the off. I don't know if that's going to prevent this from actually turning. We'll see in a second. But if I turn this on, okay, good. We don't have the engine's not going to try and start. I don't know if this requires the clutch to be held to start either, but luckily I have that button installed. We are in neutral, so that if for some strange reason it tries to start up, it won't, well, number one, it's not going to start if it doesn't spark plugs. That was a stupid idea. Anyway, so now I'm just going to see if the starter kicks over at all. Okay, that sounds really healthy actually. It smells disgusting because it's pushing all that old stuff up and around through the pistons. So I'm just going to on and off run this a couple times and let that oil move around, maybe get the pump, you know, trying to create some oil pressure. Okay, so after an incredible amount of work with the gas tank, from bondo to dent repair to rebondoing again, and then finally getting a top coat and the clear coat on, I am successfully finished with the gas tank from a painting and clear coat perspective. It may be difficult to see in the camera, but there is one spot down here where unfortunately I had the spray gun kind of hit the side of a little applicator handle that I was using, and it spritzed and made some bad orange peel or runs or something in that area. But the rest of the gas tank I'm extremely impressed with in terms of how the paint looks, how the clear coat looks, and just in general, you know, the dent repair. If you recall, I had a pretty significant dent right there on the side, and you can barely see it there now. I can kind of see that it's there if I look really carefully, but it's only because I know that it was there. Otherwise, it's basically impossible. This side had that dent along the edge. Again, very difficult to tell, considering that this is a basically a 40-year-old gas tank. I think it is in excellent shape right now. I did just pick up a buffer. I have some rubbing compound, so I'm going to wet sand this and then buff it and then polish it. So I will probably do most of that off camera just because I think it's not incredibly interesting just to watch me wet sand and buff something. I'll probably take some, before and after pictures or some shots along the way, and then I'll show you the final result. All right, so I got the tank done after doing the wet sanding, the buffing, and then the polishing stages. And I'm not gonna lie, it doesn't look great. It looked way better in my opinion when I had the, after I had done the clear coat paint. And now after doing these various stages, it doesn't look 100% like how I expected to. So I'm not sure if it's because of the buffing tool that I had or the, how long I spent on each stage or something, but it just doesn't look 100% complete. I am going to leave it for now because in case I have to redo all of this, I don't want to add the decals and I have to pull the decals off and then probably have to do a lot more paint work. So I'm going to leave it how it is for now, come back to it. I'm not going to add too much gas to the tank, but I'm going to go ahead and mount the tank, hook up the carbs, hook up the spark plugs, and then see if it fires up. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that episode as much as I did with the complete rebuilding of that gas tank, the rebuilding of the clutch and brake master cylinders, the clutch slave, and every other little thing that had to get done in that episode. If you guys did enjoy, remember to like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. I've got a couple more videos coming your way shortly, but in the next episode we will hopefully, for the first time in about 4 years, get this bike to turn on. So stay tuned and I will see you guys in the next one.